Few men in history have lived with the fire, the fury, and the relentless drive of Theodore Roosevelt. He was born sickly, but he forged himself into a warrior. He was a scholar, but he thrived in the wilderness. He was a leader, but he led from the front lines. He charged into battle. He stood toe-to-toe with the most powerful men in America. He faced death in the depths of the Amazon. And through it all, he never backed down. This is not just the story of a president. This is the story of a fighter, a conqueror, an unstoppable force. A man who reshaped America, carved a canal through a continent, tamed the Wild West, shattered corporate empires, and protected the land that would become the nation's greatest treasure. A man who believed that glory was won through struggle, through the strenuous life. To Roosevelt, life was not meant to be lived in comfort. It was meant to be seized, to be fought for, to be conquered. He did not ask for greatness, he took it. This is the story of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was born on a crisp autumn morning, October 27, 1858, into the heart of New York City's aristocracy. The Roosevelt family, one of the most distinguished in Manhattan, lived in a grand brownstone on East 20th Street, wealthy, influential, a family of means. But for all the prestige and privilege, the Roosevelts could not buy what their second-born son needed most: air. From the moment he took his first breath, Theodore Roosevelt was at war with his own body. Asthma, a merciless affliction that stole the breath from his lungs, choking him in the dead of night, leaving him gasping and helpless in his mother's arms. There were no cures, no real treatments, only the terrifying, suffocating reality of waking in the darkness, desperate for oxygen that would not come. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., a man of towering strength and unwavering kindness, would pace the halls of their home with his frail son wrapped in a blanket, rushing him outside in the dead of night, hoping, praying, that the fresh air might offer relief. But the attacks kept coming. Doctors whispered of weak lungs, a delicate constitution, a life that must be lived with caution. Yet, even as a child, Theodore Roosevelt was not one to surrender. If his body was weak, his spirit would be stronger. Stronger than the gasping, stronger than the fear. He devoured books, poring over tales of warriors, conquerors, and men of unbreakable will. He became obsessed with the idea of strength, not just physical, but mental. But the weakness persisted. The asthma was a spectre that haunted his childhood, lurking in the shadows, always ready to strike. He was small, frail, and often confined to his home, watching through the windows as other boys ran and played in the streets. He was not like them, not yet. Then came the moment that would change everything. One night, as he gasped for breath, his father stood before him, not with pity, but with resolve. "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. And without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body." The words burned into the boy's soul. You must make your body. From that day forward, Theodore Roosevelt declared war, not against other men, not against politics or nations, but against his own weakness. He would not be a sickly boy, doomed to a life of fragility. He would forge himself into something greater. And so, the transformation began. Theodore Roosevelt was done being weak. His father's words, "You must make your body," echoed in his mind like a battle cry. And so, he began the fight of his life. He threw himself into physical training with the same obsession that had once kept him buried in books. It started with a small gym built by his father in their home. Heavy weights, a punching bag, a place where a frail boy could attempt to break free from the body that had shackled him for years. He was no natural athlete. His body resisted at first, the weakness fought back. But Roosevelt fought harder. Day after day, he lifted weights, gasped through push-ups, forced air into his lungs with sheer willpower. The asthma attacks still came, but instead of shrinking in fear, he pushed through. He refused to let his own body dictate the limits of his future. Then came boxing. At Harvard University, Roosevelt was still a small man, 5'8", wiry, his body still catching up to his spirit. But what he lacked in size, he made up for in relentless ferocity. He stepped into the ring, not as an athlete, but as a man possessed. He took beatings, he bled, but he never backed down. Each fight made him harder, faster, stronger. He even suffered a permanently damaged left eye from a punch. His hunger for strength pushed him beyond the ring. He became a skilled horseman, galloping through the open fields with reckless abandon, pushing the limits of control, chasing the wildness of nature. He mastered the rifle, tracking game through the thick forests, training his mind and body to work as one. He was no longer just a scholar, no longer just a boy lost in books. He was forging himself into something more. And then the philosophy took root, the idea that would define his entire life, the strenuous life. Roosevelt came to believe that struggle was not something to be feared. It was the very thing that made men great. That hardship, pain, and adversity weren't obstacles to be avoided, but challenges to be conquered. A life of ease was a life wasted. Comfort was the enemy. To be truly alive, a man had to push himself beyond his limits. I wish to preach, not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of the strenuous life. It was not just a personal creed, it became his identity. As his body strengthened, so did his mind. He was still the same book-obsessed intellectual, but now he was something more. A warrior scholar, a man who commanded respect, not demanded it. He had fought his way out of weakness, and now there was no turning back. He was ready for the next battle, because life wouldn't let up. It never does. And soon, tragedy would strike him like a hammer. But Theodore Roosevelt? He would be ready. By the time Theodore Roosevelt stepped onto the political stage, he was a different man, hardened, relentless, and hungry for the next challenge. The sickly boy was gone. In his place stood a man built for battle. And politics was a battlefield. At just 23 years old, Roosevelt stormed into New York's political scene like a thunderclap. He was young, brash, and utterly fearless. In 1881, he was elected to the New York State Assembly, one of the youngest men ever to hold the position. While others in Albany were content to line their pockets and bow to the corrupt political machines that ruled the city, Roosevelt had one mission: tear it all down. From the moment he entered the chamber, he made enemies, powerful ones. The men who had spent decades controlling New York's politics, Tammany Hall, the corrupt Democratic machine, laughed at the young upstart. A rich boy from Manhattan? A Harvard-educated bookworm? They saw him as nothing more than a nuisance, but Roosevelt wasn't there to play along. He declared war. With fiery speeches and an unyielding sense of justice, he attacked corruption head-on. He called out crooked politicians by name. He exposed backroom deals, bribes, and fraud, dragging the filth of Albany's politics into the light. He dared to go where no young politician had gone before, and soon the laughter faded. The machine bosses no longer saw him as an annoyance. They saw him as a threat. They tried to silence him. They mocked him, called him a damn cowboy, tried to bury him in red tape. But Roosevelt only pushed harder. He championed reform bills, fought for the working class, and battled the entrenched corruption that had ruled the state for decades. And then, in 1884, just as his star was rising, tragedy struck. Valentine's Day, a day meant for love, became the darkest day of his life. Within mere hours, Roosevelt lost both his wife and his mother. His mother, Martha "Mitty" Roosevelt, died of typhoid fever, and his beloved wife, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, just 22 years old, died of kidney failure after giving birth to their daughter. Roosevelt, the fighter, the unbreakable force, was shattered. In his diary, he wrote just one haunting sentence under that day's date: "The light has gone out of my life." He disappeared from politics. He vanished from New York. He fled to the wilderness of the American West, seeking solace in the harsh and unforgiving frontier. But Theodore Roosevelt was never meant to disappear. The man who had waged war against weakness, who had built himself from nothing, who had embraced the strenuous life, he would return, and when he did, he would rise higher than anyone had ever imagined, because this was just the beginning. Theodore Roosevelt had vanished, The promising young politician, the relentless reformer of New York, had disappeared into the wilderness. He was no longer the firebrand of Albany, no longer the fearless crusader against corruption. The pain of losing both his wife and mother on the same day had broken something inside him. And so, he ran. He fled to the Badlands of North Dakota, a place as harsh and unforgiving as the grief that consumed him. Here, in the wide, open expanse of America's last frontier, Roosevelt sought something greater than escape. He sought rebirth. He arrived in 1884, a city man in the land of outlaws and cattle rustlers. The Badlands were no place for the weak, freezing winters, brutal summers, and men who settled their disputes with a gun. Roosevelt, with his wire-rimmed glasses and Harvard education, seemed like a man out of place. The cowboys sneered at him, calling him Four Eyes and daring him to prove himself. But Roosevelt was never one to back down. One night in a dimly lit saloon, a drunk and rowdy gunslinger confronted him, calling him names, taunting him. Roosevelt warned him once. Then, in a blur of fists and fury, he knocked the man out cold with a flurry of punches before calmly dragging him outside and tossing him into the street. He had proven himself. Roosevelt embraced the cowboy life, riding through the wild plains, herding cattle, and hunting in the unforgiving wilderness. He chased down horse thieves, survived brutal blizzards, and even captured outlaws with his own two hands. He wasn't just living in the West. He was becoming it. It was in the Badlands that Roosevelt rebuilt himself. The sorrow that had once consumed him became fuel. He found solace in struggle, in the relentless challenge of the frontier. He wrote of his experiences, pouring his soul into books, shaping his vision of what it truly meant to be a man. He came to believe that the wild, untamed land created stronger, better people. And then, after 2 years in the wilderness, he returned. But he was no longer just Theodore Roosevelt, the New York politician. He was something more. He came back as a cowboy, a hunter, a warrior of the frontier. His shoulders broader, his mind sharper, his resolve unbreakable. He had stared down loss, faced the brutality of nature, and emerged stronger than ever. And when he returned to politics, he did so like a storm. New York was still rotten with corruption, the same political bosses still pulling the strings. But now, Roosevelt had the strength of the Badlands behind him. He bulldozed through his enemies, taking down corrupt officials and forcing real reform through sheer force of will. He became New York's police commissioner, waging war on crime and graft. He patrolled the streets at night, personally making sure officers were on duty. He took on the city's toughest criminals and exposed the deep rot within the system. Then came Washington. He was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where he rebuilt the US military with a single goal in mind: prepare for war. Because Roosevelt knew America was on the brink of something big, and when that war finally came, Roosevelt wouldn't just sit behind a desk. He would do what no other politician dared. He would lead the charge himself. Theodore Roosevelt had spent his life chasing struggle, fighting for it, embracing it, thriving in it. And now in 1898, war had arrived. The United States had declared war on Spain after the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. The Spanish-American War was raging, and Roosevelt, now Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had helped push for it. He had spent years preaching about the need for American strength. Now, he had his chance to prove it. But Roosevelt wasn't the kind of man to sit safely behind a desk while others fought. No, that wasn't his way. He resigned from his high-ranking position and volunteered for combat. He helped form a new regiment, the Rough Riders, a wild, mismatched group of cowboys, outlaws, Ivy League athletes, and hardened frontiersmen. Men who, like Roosevelt, craved the battle. Together, they set sail for Cuba, where the real test awaited. July 1st, 1898, the hills outside Santiago, Cuba. The air was thick with heat and gunpowder. The Spanish army was dug in on the heights of Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill, raining down rifle fire and artillery on the Americans below. Soldiers huddled behind cover, pinned down, afraid to move, but not Theodore Roosevelt. He mounted his horse, Texas, and rode up and down the battlefield, completely exposed to enemy fire, rallying his men. He didn't shout orders from the rear. He led from the front. Then the moment came. Roosevelt charged. Not walking, not crawling. Charging. Straight up the hill. Bullets whipping past him. Men falling around him. His rough riders, emboldened by his fearlessness, followed without hesitation. It was madness. It was Roosevelt's finest hour. Through the smoke and chaos, through the relentless gunfire, Roosevelt led his men to the top of Kettle Hill. They seized the Spanish position in a ferocious melee, then turned their attention to San Juan Hill. Again, they charged. By day's end, the hills were theirs. The Spanish army was broken, and Roosevelt had done the impossible. He had led a cavalry charge on foot, under fire, and won. Theodore Roosevelt went to Cuba as a soldier. He came back an American legend. Newspapers across the country roared his name, the dashing, fearless colonel who had led his men into battle like a warrior of old. Songs were written about him. Medals were pinned to his chest. He had always believed in the strenuous life. Now the world believed in him. America wasn't done with Theodore Roosevelt, because his next battlefield wouldn't be in Cuba. It would be the White House. Theodore Roosevelt had returned home a war hero. The newspapers couldn't print his name fast enough. The bold colonel who had charged up San Juan Hill, defying death, leading men to victory. He was no longer just a political firebrand. He was a symbol, the kind of leader Americans had always dreamed of. Fearless, strong, unbreakable. And the political world took notice. By 1898, Roosevelt's reputation was too big to ignore. The people of New York, still hungry for reform, swept him into the governor's mansion in a landslide. The same corrupt machines he had battled in his early days now feared him, because Roosevelt didn't just talk about cleaning up politics. He did it. He smashed corruption, strengthened labor laws, took on big business. Roosevelt governed with the same energy and relentless drive that had defined every fight of his life, but not everyone was thrilled with his rise. The Republican Party's elite, especially party boss Mark Hanna, saw him as a problem. Too independent, too uncontrollable. And so, they hatched a plan: bury him. When President William McKinley ran for re-election in 1900, they pushed Roosevelt into the vice presidency. It was a position of powerless prestige, a place where promising politicians were sent to be forgotten. Roosevelt hated the idea, but the party pressured him, and so, reluctantly, he accepted. The election was a landslide. McKinley was re-elected. Roosevelt was silenced, or so they thought, because just 6 months later, fate intervened. September 6, 1901, Buffalo, New York. President William McKinley was shaking hands with supporters at the Pan American Exposition when an assassin, Leon Czolgosz, stepped forward and shot him twice in the chest. The bullets tore into his body, but at first the president seemed to rally. Doctors were optimistic. America held its breath. Roosevelt, thinking McKinley would recover, went on a hiking trip in the Adirondack Mountains. But then, everything changed. McKinley's condition worsened. Infections set in. On September 14, 1901, McKinley died. And just like that, Theodore Roosevelt was president. At 42 years old, he became the youngest man to ever hold the office. The man the political establishment had tried to bury was now the most powerful leader in the nation. And unlike his predecessors, Roosevelt wasn't going to wait. From the moment he stepped into the White House, he made it clear. This was not McKinley's presidency. This was Roosevelt's America. A new era had begun. Theodore Roosevelt did not ease into the presidency. He seized it. From the moment he stepped into the White House, he made it clear. This would not be a quiet administration. There would be no waiting, no hesitation. Roosevelt had fought his entire life against illness, against corruption, against the limits others placed on him. And now, at the helm of the most powerful nation on earth, he was just getting started. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was in the grip of industrial giants. The robber barons, men like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, had built vast corporate empires that dominated entire industries. These weren't just successful businesses, they were monopolies. They crushed competition. They controlled prices to eliminate small businesses. They manipulated the government to protect their power. The economy belonged to them, not to the American people. No president before Roosevelt had dared to stand up to them. Roosevelt was different. He saw monopolies, known as trusts, as a threat to democracy itself. If a handful of men controlled the economy, then ordinary Americans had no real freedom. And so Roosevelt declared war. His first target? J.P. Morgan himself. J.P. Morgan was not just any businessman. He was the most powerful man in America. A banker so wealthy and influential that when the US government faced financial crises, Morgan had personally bailed it out. He believed he was untouchable. Roosevelt had other plans. In 1902, Roosevelt's Justice Department filed a massive lawsuit against Northern Securities Company, a railroad monopoly controlled by J.P. Morgan, James J. Hill, and E.H. Harriman. Morgan, confident as ever, tried to handle Roosevelt the way he handled every politician. "Send your man to see my man," Morgan told Roosevelt. "We'll fix this up." Roosevelt refused. "That can't be done," he told Morgan. Instead of cutting a deal, Roosevelt took Morgan's railroad empire to court, and in 1904 the Supreme Court ruled against Morgan, breaking apart Northern Securities. It was a shocking victory. For the first time, big business was being held accountable, and Roosevelt was just getting started. By the end of his presidency, Roosevelt had prosecuted 44 trusts, including Standard Oil, American Tobacco, and the beef industry. Corporate America had never faced a president like him before. But Roosevelt didn't just fight for competition, he fought for workers. In 1902, the United Mine Workers, 150,000 coal miners, went on strike. They demanded better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Coal wasn't just another resource, it was the lifeblood of America. Cities relied on coal for heat. Factories depended on it to run, and winter was approaching. The mine owners, led by George Bear, refused to negotiate, believing the government would do what it always did, side with big business. But Roosevelt wasn't like other presidents. He invited both sides to the White House. It was the first time in US history that a president personally intervened in a labor dispute. But the mine owners were arrogant. They refused to compromise. They mocked Roosevelt and insisted the strike would end when the workers got hungry enough. Roosevelt was furious, and so he did something that shocked the nation. He threatened to send federal troops, not to break the strike, but to seize the mines and run them as a government operation. The owners caved. The miners won a 10% wage increase and a shorter workday. It was a historic moment. For the first time, a president had stood up to industry for the workers, and Roosevelt's message was clear. The government would not just protect the rich, it would protect the people. Roosevelt's fight didn't stop with business and labor. He believed government existed to serve the people, and that meant reform. At the time, America's food and drug industries were riddled with filth and corruption. Meat was processed in disgusting, disease-ridden factories. Dangerous chemicals were added to food with no oversight. Fake medicines promised cures, but often contained cocaine, morphine, and alcohol. Then came Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. It exposed the horrors of Chicago's meatpacking industry. Workers losing fingers in grinders, rats running through the factories, meat laced with filth. Roosevelt read it and took action. He pushed through the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, creating federal regulations to keep America's food safe. It was the birth of the FDA. Theodore Roosevelt did not just want to lead America, he wanted to reshape the world itself. And to do that, he needed to do something no one had ever done before: split a continent in two. For centuries, the world's greatest powers had dreamed of a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, a passage that would allow ships to avoid the treacherous 8,000-mile journey around South America. The idea of a canal through Central America had been debated for decades, but every attempt had ended in failure, disaster, or death. The French had tried first. In the 1880s, the same team that had built the Suez Canal in Egypt set their sights on Panama, then a province of Colombia. Led by the famous engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French believed they could dig a canal through the dense jungle just as they had cut through the deserts of North Africa. They were wrong. Panama was not the flat sands of Egypt. It was an unforgiving, disease-ridden jungle with towering mountains, raging rivers, and relentless tropical storms. And then there were the diseases. Malaria and yellow fever tore through the workforce, killing thousands. Workers collapsed under the blazing heat and torrential rains. Mudslides swallowed entire construction sites. Supplies were impossible to move through the thick jungle. Within a decade, the French effort had collapsed. By 1890, over 20,000 workers were dead. The French abandoned the project in disgrace. It was considered impossible. But Roosevelt? Roosevelt didn't believe in impossible. By the time Roosevelt took office in 1901, America was rising as a global power. The economy was booming, the Navy was expanding, and Roosevelt saw the future of American dominance on the seas. But without a canal, the US Navy was divided. If war broke out, ships on the Atlantic coast would take weeks to reach the Pacific. The canal wasn't just about trade. It was about military strength, national security, and global power. Roosevelt was determined to make it happen. There was just one problem: the land belonged to Colombia. Roosevelt offered to buy the land to complete the French canal, but the Colombian government, sensing an opportunity to squeeze more money out of the deal, refused. They demanded outrageous sums, stalling negotiations. Roosevelt would not wait. And so, in 1903, he backed a Panamanian revolution. Panama had long wanted independence from Colombia. Roosevelt gave them the push they needed. With American warships stationed off the coast, Panama declared independence. Colombia was powerless to stop it. Within days, Roosevelt recognized Panama as a new nation. And in return, Panama granted the United States full control over the canal zone. It was bold, it was ruthless, it was classic Roosevelt. And now, with the land secured, the real battle began. The challenge was unlike anything in history. Mountains had to be carved apart, rivers had to be redirected, the jungle had to be tamed. The project was divided into three massive engineering feats. The locks system. Engineers had to design massive water-filled locks to lift ships 85 feet above sea level before dropping them down on the other side. The Culebra Cut. A massive trench had to be blasted through the mountains, one of the largest excavation projects ever attempted. The disease battle. The deadliest enemy wasn't engineering, it was mosquitoes. Malaria and yellow fever had already killed thousands of French workers. If America didn't stop it, the canal would fail. Roosevelt sent in Dr. William Gorgas, a military doctor who had studied tropical diseases. His solution? A war on mosquitoes. Swamps were drained. Standing water was eliminated. Workers fumigated entire cities to destroy mosquito breeding grounds. Within 2 years, malaria deaths plummeted. The disease was beaten, and with it the biggest obstacle to finishing the canal was gone. Roosevelt didn't just oversee the canal from Washington. In 1906, he became the first sitting US president to leave the country, traveling to Panama to see the work himself. Dressed in a white suit and Panama hat, he toured the canal, rode the steam shovels, and waded into the mud alongside the workers. He wanted them to know, "I am with you. This is not just a government project. This is our mission." His visit electrified the workforce. Morale skyrocketed. The workers weren't just digging, they were making history. By 1914, the impossible had been achieved. The first ships sailed through the Panama Canal, proving that Roosevelt's vision had been right all along. The results? Trade routes transformed. The canal cut the journey between New York and San Francisco from 13,000 miles to 5,000 miles. The US Navy could now move ships between the Atlantic and Pacific in days, not months. The US now controlled one of the most valuable waterways on Earth. When asked about the canal, Roosevelt simply said, I took the canal zone and let Congress debate. And while the debate goes on, the canal does too. The Panama Canal was not just a waterway. It was a testament to Roosevelt's philosophy. A belief that when faced with impossible odds, when others gave up, when nature itself stood in the way, you charge forward anyway. He had split a continent in two, and in doing so, he reshaped history forever. Theodore Roosevelt didn't just love nature, he believed in it. To him, the American wilderness was more than just land. It was the soul of the nation. A frontier that had shaped men into warriors, pioneers, and builders of empires. And if that wilderness was destroyed, so too was America's strength. But by the early 20th century, the country's natural beauty was vanishing. Forests were disappearing. Loggers cut down millions of acres with no thought of replanting. Rivers were being polluted. Industrial waste poured into streams, choking out fish and wildlife. Buffalo, elk, and other species were on the brink of extinction. Hunters killed them in droves for sport, with no restrictions. For decades, no president had cared. No one had thought to protect the land, the wildlife, or the resources that made America great. Roosevelt was about to change that forever. Roosevelt wasn't just a politician, he was an outdoorsman. He had spent years hunting in the Dakota Badlands, riding through the Rocky Mountains, and exploring the wilds of Yellowstone. He had seen firsthand what was happening. The American wilderness was vanishing before his eyes. He refused to let it happen. In 1903, Roosevelt set out on a legendary camping trip in California's Yosemite National Park. His guide, John Muir, the most famous naturalist in America. Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, had spent his life fighting to protect the country's last wild places. He took Roosevelt deep into Yosemite, where they camped under the towering sequoias, listening to the wind sweep through the ancient trees. For 3 days, Roosevelt and Muir rode on horseback through the mountains, explored hidden valleys, and stood beneath waterfalls. They talked about the future, about what would happen if nothing was done. When Roosevelt left Yosemite, he was changed. He didn't just believe in conservation, he was now obsessed with it. And as president, he would make saving America's wilderness his mission. Before Roosevelt, the federal government had never protected land. If you were a logging company, a mining corporation, or a railroad tycoon, you could take as much as you wanted, and no one would stop you. Roosevelt stopped them. Roosevelt pushed through the Antiquities Act, a groundbreaking law that gave the president the power to declare national monuments, protecting landmarks, landscapes, and ancient sites from destruction. And he used it like a weapon. Devil's Tower in Wyoming, America's first national monument, a towering rock formation sacred to Native Americans. The Grand Canyon, saved from mining companies that wanted to tear it apart for minerals. Roosevelt declared, "Leave it as it is. You cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it." Muir Woods in California, protected so future generations could walk among the ancient redwoods. Petrified Forest, Arizona, saved from looters who were stealing the fossilized trees. In all, Roosevelt protected 18 national monuments, ensuring some of America's greatest wonders would never be destroyed. But he wasn't done yet. Roosevelt didn't just want to save single monuments. He wanted to create vast, untouched wildlands permanently protected for future generations. Before him, there were only 5 national parks. He added 5 more: Crater Lake, Oregon, a sapphire blue lake inside an ancient volcano, Wind Cave, South Dakota, one of the longest cave systems in the world, Sully's Hill, North Dakota, a sanctuary for wild bison and elk, Mesa Verde, Colorado, protecting the cliff dwellings of the ancient ancestral Puebloans, Platte, Oklahoma, a place of natural mineral springs. But even this wasn't enough. Roosevelt wanted to protect forests, rivers, grasslands, and wildlife, millions of acres, not just a few parks. So he did something no president had ever done before. He created the U.S. Forest Service. With the stroke of his pen, Roosevelt saved 150 national forests, protecting over 230 million acres of public land. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the entire country of France. Roosevelt knew that America's wildlife was just as endangered as its forests. For centuries, hunters had slaughtered animals by the millions. The American buffalo, once 60 million strong, had been reduced to less than 1,000. Birds were being killed by the thousands, so their feathers could be used in women's hats. The Roosevelt elk was almost wiped out, an animal that bore his family's name. Roosevelt fought back. He created 51 federal bird reserves, the first ever protected wildlife areas. He established 4 national game preserves, safe havens for elk, bison, and deer. He passed the first laws protecting migratory birds, stopping them from being hunted into extinction. His actions saved entire species from vanishing forever. Not everyone supported Roosevelt's conservation efforts. Big business hated him. Loggers, miners, and developers saw him as a threat to profits, and even Congress tried to stop him. In 1907, furious politicians passed a law stripping Roosevelt of his power to create more national forests. Roosevelt saw it coming. Before the law took effect, he rushed to sign orders protecting 16 million more acres of forest, securing them forever. By the time Congress realized what he had done, it was too late. Roosevelt had won. By the time Theodore Roosevelt left office in 1909, he had created 5 new national parks, established 18 national monuments, saved 150 national forests, protected 230 million acres of land, created 51 bird reserves and 4 game preserves. No president before, or since, has done more for conservation. His actions preserved America's wild beauty for generations. Without Roosevelt, there would be no Grand Canyon National Park, no Yosemite as we know it, no protected forests. His vision? That every American, no matter how rich or poor, should be able to experience the wild. The nation behaves well if it treats its natural resources as assets which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value. To this day, every time someone hikes in a national park, watches an eagle soar, or stands beneath an ancient redwood, they walk in Roosevelt's shadow. He didn't just protect the land, he made sure the American wilderness would never die. Roosevelt had transformed the presidency. He wasn't just a leader, he was a warrior. He fought monopolies, defended workers, protected the land, and built America into a true world power. By 1908, after nearly 8 years in office, he had done what few leaders ever do. He walked away at the height of his power. He could have run for another term, but he stuck to his promise. He left the White House, handing the reins to his chosen successor, William Howard Taft. But Roosevelt was not a man built for retirement. The fire inside him would never be extinguished. And soon, he would return to the battlefield once more. This time, against his own party, against a new political machine, and even against death itself, because Theodore Roosevelt's story was far from over. Roosevelt believed in Taft. He saw him as a man who would carry on the fight, continue the reforms, and build upon the progress they had made together. With a firm handshake, Roosevelt departed Washington, setting off on a grand adventure, a year-long safari in Africa. He had no idea that while he was hunting big game, his greatest political battle was waiting for him back home. At first, Roosevelt had no reason to doubt Taft. The two had been close allies, and Roosevelt had personally backed him for the presidency. But as months turned into years, rumors began to reach him. Whispers that Taft was undoing everything they had fought for. By the time Roosevelt returned to America in 1910, the truth was clear. Taft had abandoned the fight. He had allowed big business to regain its hold on Washington. He had fired Roosevelt's close friend and conservationist Gifford Pinchot, signaling a retreat on Roosevelt's environmental legacy. He had sided with party bosses instead of the people. Roosevelt was furious. This was not the future he had envisioned. This was not the America he had fought to build. And so he did the only thing he could do. He came back. In 1912, Roosevelt did the unthinkable. He challenged a sitting president from his own party. He demanded the Republican nomination. And when the party elite, desperate to keep control, rigged the convention in Taft's favor, Roosevelt walked out. But he wasn't finished. If the Republican Party would not let him lead, he would build a new party himself. Roosevelt formed the Progressive Party, a new movement built on his vision of reform, fairness, and justice. It was a bold, radical move. No third-party candidate had ever come close to winning the presidency. But Roosevelt had never been interested in doing what was safe. When asked about his health and ability to run, Roosevelt, always the warrior, grinned and declared, "I'm as strong as a bull moose." The name stuck, and the Bull Moose Party was born. With Roosevelt at its head, the 1912 election became one of the most dramatic in American history. It was a three-way war between William Howard Taft, the sitting Republican president, backed by the party elite, Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic challenger, and Roosevelt, the renegade, the fighter, the man who refused to be silenced. Roosevelt took his campaign across the country, delivering speech after speech, hammering home his vision of progressivism and rallying the people like no one else could. Then, an assassin came for him. October 14, 1912, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Roosevelt was preparing for another campaign speech. The energy in the air was electric. He had battled political machines, corporate giants, and his own party. Now, he was marching toward Election Day like a general heading to war. Then a gunshot. A man named John Schrank had fired a revolver at Roosevelt's chest. The bullet pierced his steel eyeglass case and a folded 50-page speech in his coat pocket before lodging in his body. Roosevelt staggered. The crowd gasped. His guards rushed forward. He was bleeding, but Roosevelt did not fall. He did not panic. He put a hand to his chest, felt the blood, and realized he was still breathing. And then, in an act of sheer, unbelievable defiance, he did the impossible. He refused medical attention. Instead, he stepped onto the stage, stood before the crowd, and gave his speech anyway. Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. For 90 minutes, Roosevelt spoke, blood seeping into his shirt. The bullet remained inside him, but he never stopped. Only after finishing his speech did he allow himself to be taken to the hospital. Doctors determined the bullet was too dangerous to remove. It would remain inside him for the rest of his life. Roosevelt's campaign was the most electrifying in history. He won more votes than any third-party candidate before or since, but in the end, the split in the Republican vote allowed Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency. Roosevelt had fought like a warrior, but this battle was lost. And yet, he had changed America forever. His progressive ideals paved the way for future reforms. His challenge to the two-party system showed that no man, no machine, no political elite could silence the will of the people. Even in defeat, he remained a force. But Theodore Roosevelt was not done yet, because his greatest adventure was still ahead. A journey deep into the Amazon, a journey that would take him to the very edge of life and death. Theodore Roosevelt had spent his life seeking struggle, danger, and the next great challenge. But in 1913, at the age of 55, he would embark on a journey unlike anything he had ever faced. A journey that nearly killed him. A journey into the heart of the Amazon. After his crushing defeat in the 1912 election, Roosevelt was restless. He had fought in politics, in war, and in the wilderness. But he was not ready to slow down. Then came an invitation. Brazil's government offered Roosevelt the chance to explore an uncharted river in the Amazon rainforest. A waterway so dangerous, so unknown, that it was simply called the River of Doubt. Roosevelt could not resist. This was no safari, no pleasure trip. It was an expedition into the wild. The river stretched 600 miles through untouched jungle, where no outsider had ever set foot. The dangers, endless. Treacherous rapids, poisonous insects, venomous snakes, deadly piranhas, hostile indigenous tribes, armed with poisoned arrows. Many thought the expedition was suicidal. But Roosevelt, he had already faced death before. In December 1913, Roosevelt and his team, including his son Kermit Roosevelt and Brazil's famous explorer Cândido Rondon, plunged into the jungle. From the very start, the expedition was a nightmare. The river was wild and unpredictable. Massive rapids shattered their canoes, forcing them to hack through dense jungle to go around. Supplies ran dangerously low. The oppressive heat, the swarms of insects, the ceaseless hunger, it all wore them down. Then, the illnesses began. One by one, men fell sick. Dysentery, fevers, infections. The jungle was merciless. Roosevelt himself was not spared. Days into the journey, Roosevelt sliced his leg open on a rock while trying to save a capsized canoe. At first, it was just a wound, but in the tropics, wounds fester. Infection set in, turning into tropical fever. Roosevelt burned with sickness. He was delirious, shivering from fever, his body wasting away. The strong, unbreakable bull moose was fading. At one point, he called his son Kermit to his side. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper. "Go on without me," he told him. "Leave me here and save yourselves." But Kermit refused. The men refused. Roosevelt was carried in a makeshift raft, drifting down the river as his body fought against death itself. Through sheer willpower, he survived. But the journey had taken its toll. He had lost over 50 pounds. The once invincible Roosevelt returned home a shadow of himself. And yet, he had done it. The River of Doubt was no longer a mystery. It was charted, explored, conquered. And because of Roosevelt, it now had a new name: Rio Roosevelt. The expedition had taken more than just Roosevelt's strength. It had shortened his life. By the time he returned to America, he was never the same. The great warrior, the man who had charged up San Juan Hill, battled corrupt politicians, and stared down assassins, was finally feeling the weight of time. But even in his weakened state, he never stopped fighting. He denounced President Wilson for keeping America out of World War I, urging the country to take action. He volunteered to fight when war finally came in 1917, but was rejected due to his health. He watched his youngest son, Quentin, die in combat, one of the few moments that truly broke him. By 1919, the once unstoppable force of nature was fading. Then, on the night of January 5th, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt went to bed as he always did. But in the early hours of the morning, his body finally gave out. He died in his sleep. The nation mourned. When the news reached Vice President Thomas Marshall, he simply said, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight." Roosevelt was more than a president. He was a warrior, an explorer, a reformer, and a force of nature. He transformed America's government, protected its wilderness, and reshaped the presidency into a position of true power. He lived without fear. He embraced the strenuous life. And even in death, he remains one of the most electrifying figures in American history, because Theodore Roosevelt never stopped charging forward. Not in war, not in politics, not in the Amazon, and not in life. Theodore Roosevelt was not just a president. He was a force of nature, a man who refused to live an easy life, a man who believed that greatness was earned through struggle, through sweat, through the sheer force of will. He was the sickly boy who fought his way to strength, the fearless warrior who charged up San Juan Hill, the president who took on the most powerful men in America and won, the explorer who risked death in the heart of the Amazon. He never stopped moving, never stopped fighting, never stopped pushing himself to be more. And in doing so, he reshaped not just America, but history itself. Because of him, corporate monopolies were broken. Because of him, workers had a voice. Because of him, millions of acres of wilderness were saved. Because of him, a canal was carved through a continent. He did not seek comfort. He did not accept weakness. He lived every second of his life by the philosophy that defined him, the strenuous life. Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in the grey twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat,